That morning I chose the finest suit among my old ones because I hadn't bought anything new in over 15 years. The shoulders had softened with time, the lining frayed at the edges, but I brushed it clean and fastened each button as if it still belonged to the life I used to have. On the table, a small gift box waited under a red ribbon. Inside wasn't a watch nor an envelope of cash, but the deed to a house I had bought with every penny of my retirement. Every coin my late wife and I had hidden away in coffee tins and dresser drawers, meant to be my son's surprise on his wedding day. I slipped my arm into the jacket. The phone rang. His name lit the screen. "Dad," he said. Voice flat, careful like he was reading instructions. "I think you shouldn't come to the wedding. It would be better for everyone." The room tilted. 30 years of patched roofs, skipped meals, and quiet midnights at the sewing machine vanished into the click of his breath on the line. I looked at the box, the ribbon, the paper, the weight of all we had saved, and knew the story of this wedding would not be the one he planned. A celebration built on forgetting can't stand when the truth finally walks in. If you were in my place, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. The phone went silent, but its echo hung in the room like smoke. My hand dropped to the table, brushing against the gift box, its ribbon trembling, as though it too had hurt him. For months, I had imagined giving it to Daniel. I had pictured his eyes widening, his smile breaking free, the relief in his bride's voice when she realized her new family had a foundation. I wanted them to start not from debt, but from security. I wanted to say, "This house is yours now. Your mother and I saved it for you." Instead, I stood alone in a kitchen that smelled faintly of lemon and dust. The clock on the wall ticked 3 minutes slow but stubbornly faithful, like everything in this house. I looked around at the evidence of years, the chipped mug my granddaughter had painted with her tiny hands, the rosemary plant spilling over the path outside, the photographs lining the wall. Every frame told a story. Every story told of sacrifice. The first sacrifice was land, our land. It wasn't much, just a narrow strip that Helen had inherited from her parents, a place we thought we might one day retire to, maybe plant rows of vegetables, maybe build something smaller when our bodies grew tired. But then tuition bills came like storms, and there was no shelter strong enough. I remember the day we signed the papers, sitting in a dim office that smelled of old ink and mildew. Helen's hands trembled as she wrote her name. She smiled at me, a smile that tried to be brave. "It's just land," she whispered. "Daniel's future is worth more." Her eyes betrayed her. They glistened with grief even as her lips formed hope. We left lighter in property, heavier in purpose. That land might have carried us into old age. Instead, it carried Daniel into lecture halls we could never have afforded otherwise. Mr. Carter, our neighbor, had walked past the house that evening. He saw us on the porch. Helen pressing the folded deed into my hands as though it were still alive. "Everything all right?" he asked gently. Helen smiled too wide. "Just making room for Daniel's dreams," she said. Carter didn't press, but I saw the pity in his eyes. He knew the cost. The second sacrifice was Helen's body. Night after night, the kitchen lamp burned when the rest of the street slept. I can still see her hunched at the table, glasses perched low, needle flashing through cloth. She repaired uniforms, hemmed skirts, stitched dresses until her fingers swelled. Every seam was a coin. Every coin was a step for Daniel. I begged her to rest, begged her to see a doctor when the cough grew harsher. But she only tucked the handkerchief deeper into her apron pocket. Once I woke near dawn and found her asleep over her work. The needle still threaded her breath, rattling shallow. I covered her with a blanket, but in the morning she was back at it. "It's for Daniel," she said, voice thin but steady. "Always for Daniel." Even Mrs. Alvarez, her closest friend, knew. She often stopped by with baskets of fruit or bread. One evening she found Helen pale, the needle trembling in her hand. "You'll break yourself," Alvarez scolded softly. Helen smiled. "Better me than his future." The third sacrifice was mine. One stormy night when Daniel was just a boy, fever consumed him. His skin burned, his breath rasped, his small body shaking. The phone lines were dead, the roads washed out, no ambulance would come. I wrapped him in my coat, pressed him to my chest, and ran into the storm. Rain lashed my face, mud swallowed my shoes, wind shoved me sideways, but I kept going. My arms numbed, my lungs screamed, but I whispered with every step, "Hold on, son. Just hold on." By the time I staggered into the hospital, I could barely stand. The nurses pried him from my arms and rushed him away. Hours later, when the fever broke, I sat in the corner soaked and shivering, whispering thanks to every god I didn't believe in. That night I swore nothing, not hunger, not storms, not sickness, would take him from me. At the factory, the men heard about it days later. Lawson, who worked the night shift beside me, clapped me on the shoulder. "You'll kill yourself for that boy," he said. I only nodded. He didn't understand. Killing myself was never the fear. Losing Daniel was. And the last sacrifice was Helen herself. She lay pale in our bed, the lamp casting her face in fragile light. Her hand was cold in mine, her breath shallow. She looked at me with eyes that saw everything and whispered, "Take care of Daniel, even if you're left alone." The words pierced me deeper than any blade. They were not just a plea, they were a command. I nodded, though tears blurred her face, though my chest ached with the knowledge of what was coming. Moments later, her chest stilled, but her words did not. They lived on an oath carved into my marrow. After she was gone, I tried to honor that command. I kept Sunday dinners alive. Birthdays remembered, small traditions tended like fragile plants. Daniel came at first. He sat at the table silent, but present, his fork scraping against the plates Helen had loved. I thought grief had made him quiet. I thought time would heal, but time didn't heal. It hardened. His visits grew fewer, his calls shorter. His laughter faded into someone else's world. I found myself cooking meals for two and eating alone. The photographs on the wall became ghosts. Neighbors noticed. Carter once asked, "Haven't seen Daniel around much, Tom. Everything all right?" I forced a smile. "He's busy." Carter nodded but looked away. He knew. Lawson. My coworker told me one evening, "Your boy doesn't call you like he used to, does he?" His voice held no judgment, only sadness. Even Alvarez noticed. "He's drifting," she whispered, her eyes wet. "But maybe he'll come back." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But then she appeared, the woman who would become his wife. At first I welcomed her. I cooked for her, asked her questions. She answered politely, smiling at all the right moments. But her eyes never lingered. She looked at me the way people look at furniture they don't plan to keep. When she was around, Daniel's warmth cooled. His visits shortened. Holidays passed with excuses. He laughed but at her jokes. He smiled but toward her. I became a shadow in my own home. And then came the words that broke something in me. One night, Daniel came to collect old boxes from his room. I asked if he would stay for dinner. He shook his head. I pressed him gently. His eyes, Helen's eyes, without her kindness, turned cold. "Dad, you don't have to worry about me anymore. I'm not a kid. You've done enough." Done enough. As if fatherhood ended. As if sacrifice had an expiration date. As if love was a ledger that could be balanced and closed. He left quickly that night, and the silence that followed was louder than anything I had ever heard. The invitation to his wedding arrived weeks later. Not by his hand, but by mail. My name printed neatly and personally, like I was a guest among many, not the man who had raised him. I held it in my hands, heavy as stone. Still, I told myself I would go. I even prepared the gift box with the deed to the house, the last offering of a father's hands. I convinced myself that maybe when he saw it, he would remember. Maybe when he saw me, something inside him would break open again. But then came the phone call. His voice calm, rehearsed. "Dad, I think it's better if you don't come. It'll be easier for everyone." Easier. The words scraped against me like rusted metal. Easier for who? For him who wanted to cut me out, for her who never once called me family. For the guests who would never know the cost of the suit he wore. The books he studied, the roof he lived under. Easier, yes. For everyone but the man who built it all. That night I sat at the kitchen table staring at Helen's empty chair. The chipped mug my granddaughter had painted the photographs of a boy who had once loved me. My chest felt hollow, my hands trembling. I whispered into the silence, "Helen, I tried. God knows I tried." But grief gave way to something harder. Resolve. If Daniel thought he could erase me, he had forgotten who had written every line of his life. If he thought I had no place at his wedding, then I would remind him. Not with fists, not with anger, but with truth. The kind of truth that cannot be buried. The kind of truth that will walk into a hall uninvited and sit down anyway. The weeks after Helen's funeral blurred into each other, long gray days stitched together by silence. I cooked meals I didn't eat, left the radio on low in the evenings, waited for footsteps that never came. I thought Daniel would call more often. I thought grief would tether us together the way it had once done when life was hard. Instead, grief made him drift further. At first, I forgave it. He was young, building a life, carving out a world beyond the shadow of loss. I told myself distance was healing, but healing never came. Distance only grew. The first Christmas without her was unbearable. I roasted a chicken the way Helen used to, brushed with rosemary, and set the table for two. I polished the old silverware she had loved. When Daniel arrived, he hugged me quickly, his eyes already flicking to the phone in his hand. He answered messages as I carved the meat. He smiled, but not at me. His laughter that night belonged to someone else. Somewhere else, a stranger on the other end of his screen. I poured him wine, asked about school, about his friends, about the girl he'd mentioned once. His answers were clipped, distracted. By dessert, he claimed he had to leave. I cleared the plates alone, the chicken cold on both sides of the table, the silence louder than the carols playing faintly from the radio. I told myself it was just the first year, that grief was heavy and time would lighten it. But the following months made the truth plain. Grief wasn't the weight between us. Indifference was. Then she appeared. The woman who would become his wife. At first I tried. I welcomed her with open arms, asked about her family, cooked meals I thought she might like. She smiled politely, answered in measured tones, thanked me at the right moments. But her eyes slid past me like I wasn't there. She never lingered in conversation. She never asked about Helen, about me, about the history of the house or the scars on my hands. To her, I was not a father-in-law. I was furniture. Necessary, tolerated, but forgettable. Daniel seemed happy with her. That was enough for me at the start. I told myself a father's duty was to step back to let the next chapter write itself, but stepping back became vanishing. The more time he spent with her, the fewer calls I received, the fewer visits he made. Holidays passed with excuses. We'll be with her family this year, Dad. Maybe next time. Even when he did come, she was always there, and with her came that invisible wall. He laughed, but his laughter leaned toward her. He smiled, but his smile never reached me. He talked, but his words stopped short, like they couldn't cross the space between us. I was present, but no longer included, a silhouette in the background of my own home. The neighbors noticed before I admitted it. Carter once leaned over the fence, shaking his head. He used to run to you, Tom, like you were the only person who mattered. Now, he walks past like you're no one. His voice wasn't cruel, only sad. But the truth of it stung worse than cruelty. Lawson, my coworker from the factory, clapped me on the back one evening and said, "Your boy doesn't stop by the floor anymore, does he? We used to see him, but not these days. Even Alvarez, dear." Alvarez whispered to me one Sunday. "He's drifting." I see it. But maybe he'll come back. Children forget, but sometimes they remember when it matters. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But then came the words that split me open. One evening, Daniel came to pick up boxes from his old room. I asked if he'd stay for coffee. He shook his head. I asked if he wanted dinner. His shoulders tightened, his hand clutched the box tighter. He looked at me, his mother's eyes staring out but stripped of her kindness. "Dad, you don't have to worry about me anymore. I'm not a kid. You've done enough." Done enough. As if love had an expiration date, as if sacrifice could be checked off a list, as if a father's work was something that could end while his son was still breathing. He left quickly, and I stood in the hall with the box-shaped hole he had left in the air. The house echoed with his absence. The photographs on the wall seemed to watch me, asking if I had really done enough. I wanted to answer. I couldn't. When Daniel announced his engagement, it came in a phone call. Quick, clinical. No dinner, no face-to-face celebration. Just a voice on the line while I stood in the kitchen staring at the lemon tree bending outside. "I'm engaged," he said. "We'll send details later." His tone was rushed, his words hollow. I congratulated him, forcing warmth into my voice, forcing pride into syllables that ached. I asked if I could help with the wedding. He hesitated, then said, "Her family's handling it." I offered money. Though my pockets were thin, I wanted to give something. His reply came, sharp, almost irritated. "It's fine, Dad. You've done enough." Again, the same words. They fell heavier the second time, pressing me deeper into the floorboards. Weeks later, the invitation came, not from his hands, but by mail. My name printed neatly on the envelope as if I were a distant acquaintance, not the man who had raised him. No note, no warmth, just a line of ink, cold and impersonal. I held it for a long time, its weight heavier than stone. I told myself I would go anyway, that perhaps the day itself would break him open, remind him of who I was, of who his mother had been. I even prepared the gift box with the deed to the house, every coin Helen and I had saved folded into those papers. It was meant to be his new beginning, my last offering. And then the phone call, his voice calm, rehearsed like he'd practiced the lines in front of a mirror. Dad, I think it's better if you don't come to the wedding. It'll be easier for everyone. Easier. The word bit deep. Easier for him to erase the man who had carried him through storms. Easier for her to never have to look at me across the aisle. Easier for the guests who would never know the truth of the suit he wore, the tuition he flaunted, the house he once lived in. Easier, yes. For everyone but the man who built it all. That night I sat at the kitchen table. The box rested beside me, the ribbon glowing faintly under the lamp. I looked at Helen's chair, empty. At the chipped mug my granddaughter had painted, bright colors fading but still stubborn. At the photographs lining the wall, a boy missing a tooth, a teenager with keys in hand, a graduate in a cheap gown. Memories pressed against me until I could hardly breathe. My chest hollowed, my hands trembled. I whispered into the silence, Helen, I tried. God knows I tried. But grief twisted into something harder, resolve. If Daniel thought he could erase me, he had forgotten who had written every chapter of his life. If he thought I had no place at his wedding, then I would remind him. Not with fists, not with anger, but with truth. Truth that cannot be buried, truth that walks even where it's not wanted, truth that will not die even when every guest wishes it silent. I rose, placed my hand on the box, and felt its weight. Tomorrow, I thought, tomorrow he will remember, whether he wants to or not. The wedding hall shimmered like something from a magazine. White roses cascaded from tall vases, silk banners hung from polished marble columns, and chandeliers sparkled above the entrance. Cars gleamed in the parking lot, sleek machines worth more than my house. My old sedan coughed as I turned off the engine. I sat a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, the box beside me on the seat. Its ribbon quivered with the tremble of my own breath. He had told me not to come. But a father does not vanish when his son begins a new life, not if that life was built on his blood. I stepped out. My shoes scuffed against the gleaming pavement, an old man among polished shoes and pressed suits. Guests in gowns and tuxedos drifted past me, their perfume thick in the air, their laughter brittle and rehearsed. Their eyes slid over me like water. Some frowned faintly. Others whispered, "Isn't that the father? Why is he outside?" I ignored them. I clutched the box tighter and walked toward the tall glass doors. Two men in black suits stepped forward, their smiles practiced. "Sir," one said, raising a hand politely but firmly. "Can we help you?" "I'm Daniel's father," I said. My voice caught but held steady. "I'm here for the wedding." The taller one pressed a finger to his earpiece, listening. A pause. Then he shook his head. His tone softened, but the words cut like glass. "I'm sorry, sir. The groom has asked that you not be admitted." The sound rang louder than the string quartet inside. Around us, guests slowed, laughter, faltering whispers blooming like weeds. My hand tightened on the box until my knuckles blanched. Heat crawled up my neck. Shame burned hot under the fine clothes of strangers. And then, "Dad!" Daniel emerged from the hall. He cut through the crowd like a blade. His suit tailored to perfection. His hair sleek, his posture straight as a groom's should be. For a heartbeat, I saw the boy he had once been, mud on his knees, holding a soccer ball too big for his arms. But the look in his eyes now strangled that memory. Cold, guarded, calculated. "I told you not to come," he said, his voice low, sharp, every word carrying. The crowd hushed their eyes, devouring every syllable. My throat tightened. I lifted the box slightly like an offering. "I just wanted to be here, to give you this." Daniel's gaze flicked to the box, then away, his jaw tightening. "This isn't about gifts. It's about you making things harder than they need to be." "Harder," I echoed. My voice cracked, then steadied. "Daniel, I am your father. I raised you." He cut me off loud enough for the guests to hear, and I am grateful. "But today isn't about you. It's about me. About us. Please don't make a scene." The whispers thickened. Faces turned hungry for scandal. My shame blazed hotter, but then something in me hardened. Enough silence. Enough erasure. I stepped forward, my voice rising steady, every syllable carrying like judgment. "Embarrassed. You speak of shame." I lifted my chin. Shame is when a father sells the only land his family owns so his son can study. Shame is when a mother sews through the night coughing blood into her apron so her son can have books. Shame is when a father carries his fever-stricken boy through a storm to the hospital praying he lives. And shame Daniel. Shame is when that boy grows into a man who tells his father he does not belong at his wedding. Gasps tore through the air. Daniel's face blanched, his bride stiffened, her painted smile cracking. Guests leaned closer, their hunger sharpening. I set the box on a table by the door, tore the ribbon loose and pulled out the papers within. Receipts, tuition checks, loan documents, the deed to the house. They trembled in my hands, but not from weakness, from years waiting to be seen. I raised them high. My voice thundered across the marble floor, louder than the music inside, louder than the whispers. Everything you are, Daniel, every step you took, every degree you earned, every roof over your head was bought with this. With my sweat, with your mother's blood, with our years we can never reclaim. Without us, without our sacrifices, this day would not exist. The hall fell silent, stunned. Then whispers erupted, sharp, urgent. He paid for all of it. Is it true? Faces swung toward Daniel, searching for denial, for defense. His bride's parents frowned, their lips pressed tight. Daniel reached toward me as if to snatch the papers away, but froze. Too many eyes were watching. His mask cracked, his hands trembled. His suit no longer looked regal, it looked borrowed. The stage was no longer his, it was mine. The truth had stepped into the wedding uninvited, and it would not leave. The silence that followed was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of a crowd holding its breath, waiting for the mask to crack. Daniel's lips parted, his face pale beneath the chandeliers. He turned toward me, then toward the guests, then back again, like a man searching for an exit that no longer existed. Finally, he forced a laugh, thin and brittle. "All right," he said, his voice rising too quickly. "Maybe Dad did all those things, but that's what parents do, isn't it? They give, they sacrifice. You don't parade it at a wedding." The guests shifted, uncomfortable. Some nodded faintly, but others frowned. The words rang hollow, bouncing uselessly against the truth that still hung in the air like smoke. And then a voice broke through, steady, firm. "He's telling the truth." Every head turned. Mr. Carter, our neighbor for decades, stepped forward from the back row. His gray hair gleamed under the lights, his back still straight despite the years. He looked at me, then at Daniel. I saw it all. I saw him patch that roof with his own hands when the storms tore it apart. I saw him walk to work in the rain because the car had been sold for your tuition. I heard Helen's sewing machine humming when the rest of the street slept, her lamp glowing until dawn. Everything he just said, I witnessed it. Every word. Murmurs exploded. Guests leaned toward one another, voices sharp. The father sold land. The mother worked sick. Is this true? Daniel's bride's hand slipped from his arm, her eyes wide, her mouth tight. Her parents exchanged glances, whispers slicing through the tension like knives. Their perfect image of the groom was cracking before the entire congregation. Daniel's jaw clenched. He tried again. That was years ago. Things are different now. We don't need to drag the past into today. But the crowd was no longer his. The crowd belonged to truth. Another voice rose, softer, but piercing. Mrs. Alvarez, Helen's oldest friend, stood slowly with the help of her cane. Her eyes were wet but steady, her voice trembling, but loud enough for all to hear. I sat with Helen many nights. I saw the blood in her handkerchief when she thought no one was looking. I held her hands when they trembled from sewing too long, and she told me over and over, "At least he'll remember, at least our son will know." Alvarez's voice broke, but she raised her chin, her finger pointing at Daniel. And now, to see you deny her, to see you silence her memory on your wedding day, shame on you. The room gasped as if struck. Guests covered their mouths, some shaking their heads, others whispering harshly. Ungrateful, how could he? His own mother. Daniel's shoulders sagged visibly under the weight of their judgment. His bride stepped back a pace, the space between them widening like a crack in marble. Her parents' whispers grew sharper, their eyes cold, already measuring scandal against reputation. Before Daniel could answer, another figure stepped forward. Lawson, my old co-worker from the factory. His face was lined, his hands scarred like mine, but his voice was iron. I worked the line with this man for years. I watched him take double shifts no one else wanted. I saw him collapse once from exhaustion, then stand back up because his boy needed tuition. He bled for that son. If Daniel stands here today in a fine suit, it is because his father wore rags to pay for it. The murmurs swelled into outrage, now a tide that no one could hold back. The string quartet lowered their instruments. The officiant stared at the floor. Guests turned openly, no longer pretending to look away. Judgment rained down heavier than the flowers falling from their vases. Daniel's face twisted, his mouth opening and closing without words. The weight of testimony of witnesses of truth pressed him into silence. I gathered the papers from the table, sliding them carefully back into the box. My hands were steady, my voice calm but carrying. I didn't come to ruin a wedding. I said each word slow. I came because I was told I did not belong. But blood cannot be erased. Sacrifice cannot be silenced. Whether you honor me or not, Daniel, this truth will remain. The silence that followed was devastating. Not the silence of shock, but of judgment fully formed. No one applauded. No one smiled. The musicians set their bows down. Even the chandeliers seemed dimmer, as though ashamed to shine on such disgrace. Daniel stood frozen, his bride rigid beside him, their perfect portrait collapsing before their guests. What was meant to be a union had become a trial, and the groom had already been condemned. I turned, lifted the box into my arms, and began to walk toward the doors. My shoes echoed against the marble floor, louder than applause, louder than whispers. The crowd parted before me. No one stopped me. No one dared. Because in that moment I was no longer the unwanted father. I was the truth itself, carried on legs that would not bow. Behind me, voices rose, some angry, some weeping, some cold. But I didn't turn back. I pushed open the doors, and the storm outside welcomed me like an old friend. The doors groaned shut behind me, sealing the hall and its murmurs away. Outside, the storm had found its voice. Rain lashed at the steps. The wind bent umbrellas sideways, and the marble gleamed slick beneath the pounding water. My shoes hit the stone with slow, deliberate thuds. Every step echoed, every splash sounded louder than the whispers I had left behind. The box pressed into my chest, heavier now, though nothing inside had changed. The weight came not from paper, but from truth laid bare. I descended the stairs, each footfall sharp in the storm's rhythm. Guests watched through the glass doors, their faces pale silhouettes, but none dared follow. The thunder rolled once low and heavy, as though the heavens themselves had sighed. The roses in the garden sagged under the downpour, their colors bleeding into the puddles. The ribbons draped along the chairs clung limp and gray. A stage set for celebration had become a ruin, as if the storm itself judged the farce inside. I walked to a bench beneath an oak, its branches trembling under the rain's assault. I sat, water soaking through my trousers, the cold biting at my bones. The box rested beside me, its cardboard softening, the red ribbon running dye like blood. I bowed my head into my hands. For the first time all day, no one was watching, and in that solitude, grief clawed through me. Helen's voice filled my ears, not as memory but as presence. Take care of Daniel, even if you're left alone. I had tried. God knows I had tried. 30 years of storms, debts, hunger, sickness. Every coin earned was turned into a brick for his life. Every thread Helen sewed was another step for him. I carried him through a fever that almost killed him. I watched Helen waste away for his future. I kept the house warm, the lights on, the traditions alive after she died. And what had it built? A man who told me I was not welcome on the day I had built for him. A son who looked at me and saw not a father but a blemish, a burden. The rain pounded harder, seeping into my skin, but I didn't move. My breaths came shallow, each one tasting of iron and regret. I thought of the Christmas dinners eaten alone, of the phone calls cut short, of the boxes he carried from his room, as though my home had never been his. Each memory was a knife, each knife twisted by his voice. You've done enough. Enough. Love has no finish line. Sacrifice does not end until the Father ends. And yet to him my life's work had already expired. I lifted my head, water streaming down my face, though I could not tell where rain ended and tears began. Across the garden, the hall's windows glowed with false warmth. I imagined the ceremony stumbling on inside, vows spoken under a shadow that no music could erase. Guests whispering, the bride stiff and pale, Daniel's jaw clenched as though he could crush the truth with his teeth. Perhaps they would go through this motion, perhaps they would smile for the photographs. But those photographs would never be free of the echo of my voice. They would never be free of the witnesses who had spoken. The truth now lived among them, permanent as ink. For the first time in years, I felt something strange. Not peace, not joy, but dignity. I had been erased for so long that I had nearly believed I was gone. But I was not gone. I had spoken. I had been heard. And sometimes being heard once is enough to change everything. I rose from the bench, my knees stiff, my breath ragged. The box sagged in my hands, winter dripping from its corners. I held it close the way I once held a feverish boy against my chest, praying he would live. The oak groaned above me, leaves rattling like applause from ghosts. Thunder rumbled again, but softer this time, less a roar than a reminder. The storm was not against me, it was with me. I walked slowly toward the car. Each step splashed the water, sucking at my shoes, but my back remained straight. I passed the garden chairs, the soaked roses, the torn ribbons. They looked like remnants of a dream dissolved. By the time I reached the lot, the storm had softened to drizzle. My car sat alone now, the other vehicles hidden by the curtain of rain. I opened the door, set the box on the passenger seat, and lowered myself behind the wheel. The steering wheel was cold, slick with water from my hands. I sat there for a long time, listening to the patter on the roof, the hiss of tires on distant roads. "Helen," I whispered, "did I do right?" No voice answered. But the rain tapped against the glass in a rhythm that sounded like her sewing needle, steady, unrelenting, creating something out of nothing. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I could smell the fabric, hear her hum, feel her presence. She had not asked me to be silent. She had asked me to take care of Daniel. And sometimes taking care is not giving more. Sometimes it is reminding him of what he already had, even if it hurts, even if it ruins a day built on lies. I started the engine. The car shuddered, coughed, then steadied. I pulled out of the lot, the hall shrinking in the mirror, its glow swallowed by the rain. My reflection in the glass looked old, yes, and weary, but it also looked alive. For the first time in years, I felt the weight in my chest shift from shame to resolve. The story was not over. It had only turned a page. Night fell heavy by the time I reached the house. The storm had quieted to a drizzle, the street lamps casting pools of light onto wet pavement. I parked the car, carried the box inside, and set it on the kitchen table. The lamp hummed when I switched it on its glow, stretching across the worn wood, across the photographs that lined the wall. Helen's face watched me from a frame, her smile forever caught between pride and worry. I sat dripping, staring at her as though she might tell me what to do next. The box sagged, its cardboard soft from the storm. I opened it, shuffled through the receipts and papers, each one blurred with water but still legible. Evidence of a life spent giving. I set them aside. They had served their purpose. What remained was the future and the choice of who it would belong to. I rose and walked to the desk in the corner. The brass handle of the drawer was cold against my palm. It stuck slightly, as it always did, then gave way with a creak. Inside lay an envelope, thick and sealed, with my own handwriting scrawled across it, "Last Will and Testament." My stomach clenched as I lifted it. For years it had waited there, silent, unseen, but heavy. I sat back at the table, broke the seal, and unfolded the pages. The first version of that will had been written in grief. Helen had just passed, and I had felt unmoored, directionless. I told myself the only thing left was to secure Daniel's future. Every line had bent toward him, the house, the savings, the land. All to him, because who else was there? He was our only son. The thought of leaving him nothing had seemed unthinkable, almost cruel. To be a father was to give until you could give no more. That was what I had believed. But as the years stretched, as his visits thinned and his voice hardened, I began to doubt. Slowly, quietly, I had rewritten the lines. At first, just small changes, a clause here, a detail there, then larger ones. Until finally the words on the page declared something else entirely. I read them now aloud, my voice low but firm, as though Helen sat across from me. I leave all property, assets, and accounts not to my son Daniel, but to my granddaughter. The words sat heavy in the room. My throat tightened, my chest ached. To speak them was to betray the oath I had once sworn. But to not speak them was to betray Helen herself, and every night she bled for his future. For my granddaughter was the only one who still ran to me with open arms, who still painted mugs for me with crooked letters, who still called me Grandpa with joy instead of obligation. She had not forgotten. She had not erased me. She had not tried to lock me out of the story. And it was her smile, not Daniel's cold eyes, that deserved to inherit what we had built. Guilt pressed hard. Fathers are supposed to provide for their sons no matter what. But love without respect is not love, it is bondage. And I had lived too long to spend the rest of my days bound to a son who saw me as nothing. My hand shook as I folded the pages again. But it was not weakness. It was release. "This is not revenge," I whispered into the silence. "This is justice. This is truth finding a way to live on." I didn't stop there. I needed the words to be more than paper in a drawer. I needed them to be law, unshakable. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. 4 rings, then a voice weary but kind. Whitaker and Boone after-hours line. "This is Thomas Reed," I said. "I wrote a will with you years ago. I need to make changes, tonight." A pause. Then the voice softened. "Tom, it's Elaine. I remember you. Helen made us tea in the office the day you first came. Come by, I'll open the doors." The office smelled of paper and rain when I arrived. Elaine's hair was more silver now, her glasses lower on her nose, but her eyes held the same steady kindness. She poured coffee into paper cups and said nothing about my damp clothes. We sat at her desk, spread the papers, and worked. "Are you sure, Tom?" she asked, once her pen hovering. "This is final. There are ways to leave room for reconciliation." I shook my head. "If reconciliation comes, it will not be because of money. It will be because of truth. And the truth is my granddaughter deserves this, not him." She nodded and wrote, her pen scratched across the pages, each stroke a chisel carving permanence. We created a trust. We moved the deed into it. We updated every account, every designation. We sealed letters to my granddaughter, one for her 18th birthday, one for the day she might lose me too. Elaine notarized, stamped, filed. The sound of the stamp hitting paper thudded in my chest like a drumbeat. Final, certain. When it was done, she closed the folder and slid it across to me. "You're not the first father to do this," she said softly. "But you may be the bravest one I've seen." I smiled faintly. Bravery has nothing to do with it. It's just time someone told the truth and refused to be erased. Back home, I placed the binder on the highest shelf beside Helen's cookbooks. My hand lingered on its spine. The house was quiet but not heavy anymore. The lemon tree outside rustled in the night wind, its leaves tapping against the window, like fingers knocking gently. I looked at Helen's photograph, her smile frozen in time. "I kept my promise," I whispered. "I took care of him as long as I could. Now I'll take care of her." For the first time in years, I felt alignment, not victory, not peace, but certainty. Tomorrow would come heavy with consequences, but I was no longer afraid. My silence had ended. My dignity had spoken, and when Daniel reached for what he thought was his birthright, he would find nothing waiting but the echo of his own choices. Morning arrived pale and gray, as though even the sun hesitated to break the silence. Light spilled through the curtains in thin stripes, dust floating in the beams. The kitchen smelled faintly of old coffee and rain. On the table sat the binder, square and immovable, its weight greater than its pages. The lemon tree outside swayed gently, leaves glistening from the night storm. I sat at the table, hands folded, listening to the house breathe. Each creak of wood, each tick of the clock reminded me I was still here, still standing. The phone buzzed. Daniel's name lit the screen. My chest tightened, but I didn't move. It buzzed again and again. I watched the screen flash the letters sharp and cold. What words could he possibly have now? An apology rehearsed, a plea shaped by his bride's parents, or just anger, hot and shallow. Whatever it was, it came too late. The silence I gave him was heavier than any word I could offer. At last the buzzing stopped. The screen went dark. The house exhaled. Moments later, the phone lit again. A different name this time. Smaller letters. Maddie, my granddaughter. My hand moved before thought. I answered. Her voice burst through, bright and trembling. "Grandpa, are you okay?" Mom said. Well, she didn't say much. She just looked upset. "And Dad, he stormed out early. I wanted to check." I closed my eyes, leaning back in the chair. "I'm all right, sweetheart." "Did you go to the wedding?" she asked, her voice curious, cautious, as though she already knew the answer. "I was nearby," I said. "Sometimes nearby is enough." There was silence on the line, soft except for her breathing. Then she whispered, "I'm glad you're okay. Will I see you this weekend?" "Yes," I said, my voice steadier now. "We'll make lemon bars, your grandmother's recipe." She laughed, the sound light and free. "Okay, I love you." "I love you too." We hung up. The quiet returned, but it no longer pressed down like a stone. I rose, slipped on my jacket, and tucked the signed will into the inside pocket, its weight pressed against my chest, not a burden but a reminder. I paused at the mantel, looking at Helen's photograph. Her eyes, forever warm, seemed to meet mine across the years. "He had his wedding," I murmured softly, "but he has lost his father, and that is the true tragedy." I locked the door behind me. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I walked down the path. The lemon tree rustled, bending but not breaking in the morning wind. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang its chime, hollow and different. I did not look back. The binder on the shelf would do that for me when the time came. I walked forward, steady, unhurried, the weight of truth close to my heart. For the first time in years, the silence felt like mine. What do you think will happen when the truth finally reaches him? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading each one. And don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. Thank you for watching.